Okay, let's quickly talk about the facial bones, sinuses, and orbits. Specifically, the major things you need to take away from this course and to apply to the final in your anatomy course. First up, facial bones. In class, we talked a little bit about the nasal and cheekbone area. You'll want to know that there are, excuse me, nasal bones here. Helpful name there. It's harder to forget. So nasal bones. Talked a little bit about the lacrimal bone. It's there next to the tear duct. Remember, lacrimal kind of refers to tears, and therefore it's near the tear duct. Another facial bone is going to be the zygoma. Notice how it makes up part of the orbit and the back of the orbit as well, the side and the posterior part of the orbit. And then we have the maxilla here. The maxilla has a process that it's extending out to join up with the zygoma. It also has an alveolar portion here at the teeth. That's where we're going to find our acanthion and the anterior nasal spine. Below it, that makes up the other half of the jaw, or the jaw here, the other half of the teeth. It's going to be the mandible, and we'll talk about that a little bit further as we go. All right, so again, that maxilla talked about the zygomatic process. That's a big one to take away, as well as the alveolar process. Acanthion's there, and the anterior nasal spine. Also within the maxilla, we discussed the maxillary sinuses that we see there. If you were to take off the mandible and look at a posterior view of the rest of the skull, you would find a palatine bone, the horizontal portions in particular. So if we were looking at it from the side, it's kind of hidden here, but it's, behind this area that we see behind there, going in the horizontal way. And we can kind of see it here. Okay, and it makes up part of the bony palate, basically. The soft palate is the soft tissues that come off of the hard palate here, which is made up of the palatine processes of the maxilla and the palatine bones here. Okay, zygomatic bones. Not much to those. Just remember where they are. They'll probably just be asked to generally label the zygoma, which is that kind of cheekbone in the front there. Nasolacrimal. We continue on. We're going to see nasal conchae or conchae. All right, so we see the hard palate again here. Remember the palatine process, the maxilla, and the horizontal portion, the palatine. That's what we were talking about here. Whereas the soft palate is just all the soft tissues that come off of it. All right, further in the nasal canal. So now we're looking through all of this into these little parts here that show up in an X-ray like this. This is the CT, but you can see a lot more detail on it here. If you were to look at it in an X-ray, it's, a little bit harder to see. But let me bring up another one so you can see it before we move on. Guess I don't have as good of an X-ray as I would hope. Okay, so we'll continue on instead of getting lost down a rabbit hole. Anyway, so this is the ethmoid bone that they're showing you a cutaway view of. So remember, we're going into that nasal cavity now. Nasal bone, here's the maxilla and so on. Inside here, that's what we're seeing. An inferior nasal concha is here. That's a facial bone. Whereas the superior middle nasal concha are part of the ethmoid. Now remember, the ethmoid is technically a cranial bone, whereas the rest that we've been talking about in this presentation are facial bones. So again, ethmoid is a cranial bone, and it does make up some of, like the facial features. For example, this part of the nose right here. So that's just a heads up. You can see them labeled here in kind of an AP view. They look like this. Cristogali, we talked a little bit about with the ethmoid. It kind of pops up on the top. If I were to look at it in this X-ray, I would label that where the E is on this X-ray. This is labeling the sinuses, but if we're going to label other things, it would be around where E is for that cristogali that we were talking about just now, right here. This is the cristogali of the ethmoid. Then we have the cribriform plate. and the perpendicular plate that goes straight up and down, kind of vertical. That's what's going to make up the bony nasal septum. So when we see it here, this line down here, that pink line right there is the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, and it makes up part of the entire bony nasal septum. We talked a little bit about how a deviated septum means that the bones and cartilage here are deviated. So they're not just a straight line up and down like we've been seeing. And then the lower part here, the facial bone, is a vomer. So those are the biggest takeaways for that. Now the mandible kind of separated out a little bit where, we group these together. Now the mandible, what to take away for that is going to be the mental point, kind of mentum, that little area, because you're going to use that in positioning a lot. Also the alveolar process of the mandible, just like the maxilla had one. The gonian, you're going to use that in positioning as well. So remember the gonian so far, definitely the mental point. And then the ramus, because there you will eventually take a closer look at TMJs or temporomandibular joints. And that's that joint here. You can feel it when you open and close your jaw. If you put your finger right in front of your ear canal and then move your jaw, open and close your mouth, you can feel it moving. That's this little joint here. And it's made by the condyle of the mandible and the temporal bone. So it's a temporal mandibular joint. All right, so remember the condyle here, the ramus, condyle, coronoid, mental point there, and then of course the gonium. So a little bit more to remember about this bone than the other facial bones. All right. Let me go through here. There's that TMJ movement, so you can see the condyle is out of the fossa here, and right here in a closed mouth view, it's back inside the fossa. All right, this is good practice if you want to take a look at that. If I just pulled one out just right off the bat, F, for example, we know those are the superior and middle nasal concha. They're part of the ethmoid bone. There was that perpendicular plate, lacrimal bone, it's over here, nasal, and so on. Something good to maybe test yourself with. And then the sinuses, frontal, ethmoid, and sphenoid are kind of superimposed in this PA or AP view. And here's a maxillary. When we turn the skull sideways, then we can separate out the ethmoid and sphenoid sinuses and still see the other ones as well. All right. Finally, maybe a close-up view is good to take away. So zygoma, already talked about that. Here's just part of the maxilla. Let's see here. So orbital surface of the maxilla. D, we can see the sphenoid bone, but we'll have a separate video about the cranial bones, and sphenoid is part of the cranium there. C, that would be part of the ethmoid. B would be that lacrimal bone again. So maybe take a look at this one too. And finally, take a look at this. Again, you'll need all of these when we get to next semester. And we talked about these as well. Glabella, Mesion, Canthian, and so on. All right.